My property was my haven, a sprawling piece of land nestled near a serene pond, surrounded by trees and wide open space. It was the perfect place for a quiet retreat, a place where I could escape the stresses of the world. Most days it was just me, the sound of birds chirping, and the occasional breeze rustling through the leaves. The pond was my favorite spot. I had spent hours over the years sitting by the water, watching the reflections of the trees ripple in the cool surface. That Saturday, the sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows across the field, and I decided it was the perfect time to spend the afternoon by the pond, taking in the quiet beauty of my surroundings. I grabbed a book and a cold drink, planning on soaking up the peace and calm of the day. But then I heard it. The loud roar of an ATV engine echoed across the property. I looked up from my book and saw Karen, my neighbor, flying down the dirt path on her bright red ATV, kicking up dust as she approached. Karen was the type of person who always seemed to be in a hurry, and her driving style was no exception. She zoomed down the path, revving the engine and weaving around obstacles like she was trying to impress someone. I could tell she was heading straight for my pond, which wasn't unusual. She often used the dirt path near it to test her driving skills, but this time, there was a different look in her eye. "Karen! Slow down!" I called out, raising my hand as if that would get her to pay attention. I'd warned her before about the bank by the pond. It was steep and dangerous, especially with an ATV. But Karen didn't slow down. In fact, it seemed like she was speeding up. "I've got this!" she shouted over the engine, clearly trying to show off. She was aiming right for the edge of the pond, as if she intended to jump it. My heart sank. "No, Karen, don't do it." But before I could get another word out, Karen's ATV hit the edge of the bank, and for a split second, I saw her fly off the edge of the pond. Her vehicle lifted into the air as if it was some kind of stunt, and in the blink of an eye, she was airborne, headed straight for the water. I could only watch in horror as the ATV plunged into the pond with a huge splash, sending water and mud flying everywhere. Karen's body disappeared beneath the surface, and I froze in shock. For a moment, the world stood still. Then, from the water, I heard Karen's voice, sputtering and swearing as she surfaced, soaked from head to toe. What the hell?" she yelled, her face a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. She scrambled to stand, the ATV now half submerged and stuck in the muddy bottom of the pond. It was clear she was fine, but the ATV, her precious ATV, wasn't going to be so lucky. I rushed over to the edge of the water, my heart still racing. "Karen, are you okay?" She shot me a glare, dripping wet and covered in muck. "Your pond is a hazard. This is your fault. You didn't warn me it was so close to the edge." I blinked, dumbfounded. "Karen, you're the one who drove straight into it. I told you to slow down." But Karen wasn't listening. She was already inspecting her ATV, which was half submerged in the water. It was clear that she wasn't as worried about her safety as she was about the damage to her vehicle. "This is your fault," she shouted, her face contorting with frustration. "I'm going to sue you for this. You've got an unsafe property, and now I'm stuck with this wreck." I stared at her, my jaw dropping. She was blaming me for her own stupidity. Before I could respond, she pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and stormed off to the side, starting her tirade to the operator. "Yes, I need help. I've had an accident. I'm at your property, and there's a pond. I need an officer here now. This is an unsafe property, and I'm injured. I'm going to sue them." I couldn't believe it. This had gone from a simple mistake to a full-blown crisis, and I wasn't sure how I was going to get out of it. I was still processing what had just occurred when Karen's ATV suddenly revved back to life with a loud roar. Karen, soaked and still fuming, tried to pull her ATV out of the pond, but it was no use. It was stuck, half submerged in the muck. I stood at the edge, shaking my head, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Karen, are you okay?" I called, though I had to admit, I wasn't feeling particularly sympathetic after the reckless stunt she just pulled. She sputtered, her face a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I'm fine. she snapped, brushing off the wet hair clinging to her face. But your pond is a dangerous hazard. I've got half a mind to sue you for this. I could hardly believe my ears. I had warned her countless times about the edge of the pond. Everyone who had ever stepped foot on my property knew the bank was steep, and it wasn't exactly a secret that the pond wasn't something you just casually drove into with an ATV. But Karen, as always, thought the rules didn't apply to her. She stood, dripping wet and seething, eyeing her stuck ATV with frustration. I should have known better than to trust your unsafe property, she muttered. Then, to my shock, she yanked out her phone and started dialing. I could only watch as she called 911, completely unfazed by the fact that she had brought this upon herself. Yes, I need emergency services, she said into the phone, her voice cold and dismissive. I've had an accident, and I'm stuck in a pond on private property. This is unacceptable. I'm going to need help, and I'm going to sue the owner. I stood there, stunned, not sure whether to laugh or scream. I could barely believe that she was calling 911 for this, especially after she had been the one driving recklessly. But before I could say anything, Karen was off the phone, and her next words were like a slap in the face. I'm suing you for damages to my ATV and for the unsafe conditions on your property. I'm not leaving here without compensation, she shouted, her words dripping with arrogance. I was floored. This wasn't just an accident anymore. It was a full-blown spectacle, and Karen was making me out to be the bad guy. The irony of it all hit me. She was suing me for her own stupidity, and here I was, standing at the edge of the pond, completely at a loss for words. But as I stared at her drenched, angry face, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't about to back down easily, and I was just getting started in figuring out how I would handle this madness. The next few days were a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. Karen didn't waste any time, and by Monday morning, I had received a formal letter from her lawyer. The envelope was thick, and when I opened it, I found a letter demanding that I pay for Karen's medical expenses, the damage to her ATV, and a claim for personal injury because she had allegedly suffered from the trauma of being soaked in my pond. It was mind-boggling. The letter claimed that Karen was in the process of filing a lawsuit against me for the unsafe conditions on my property. Apparently, she had convinced her lawyer that her accident, which, let's be clear, was the result of her own reckless driving, was my fault. I could barely wrap my head around it. I immediately called my lawyer, Maxine, who had helped me out in the past with some minor property issues. She was as stunned as I was by the letter. This is outrageous, but we can fight it, she assured me. You have a clear case. Karen's the one who drove into the pond. We just need to make sure we gather everything we need to protect yourself. I tried to stay calm, but I was fuming. I had known Karen for years, and this was the ultimate overstep. She had been reckless, ignored my warnings, and then, instead of taking responsibility for her own actions, she was trying to blame me. She had turned a silly accident into a legal battle, and now I was left dealing with her complete disregard for common sense. Maxine suggested I gather evidence, photos of the pond, the condition of Karen's ATV, and any documents showing that the area was well maintained and not a hidden danger. It wasn't just the pond that had caused her to crash. It was her own irresponsibility. But now, we had to prove it. I spent the next few days documenting everything, taking photos of the steep bank, the ATV tracks leading up to the edge, and the pond's layout. I also made sure to talk to a few of my neighbors who had witnessed Karen's previous reckless ATV rides. I wasn't going to let her get away with making me the scapegoat. Just when I thought I was getting a handle on things, I received another letter from Karen's lawyer, this time demanding compensation for her alleged emotional distress. She was claiming that the shock of the accident had caused her severe anxiety, and that she would require therapy to recover from the trauma. I read the letter over and over, trying to wrap my mind around the audacity of it. Karen was suing me for emotional damage? For an accident she caused herself? At this point, I started feeling like I was in some bizarre legal drama where reality didn't seem to matter. I called Maxine again, and she practically laughed at how ridiculous the claims were. "This is honestly ludicrous," she said. "But we'll make sure the court sees it for what it is. Let's stick to the facts. Karen was reckless, and we'll have plenty of people testify to that." Maxine's confidence was a relief, but I still couldn't believe I was having to go through all this trouble for something that could have easily been avoided if Karen had just taken responsibility. That night, I sat down to write out everything that had happened, from Karen's speeding up to the pond, to the crash, to her blaming me for it. I knew this wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about putting an end to this and showing Karen that she couldn't just run roughshod over me or anyone else in the neighborhood. But as I looked at my notes, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was a chance to send a message. If I let Karen get away with this, it would set a dangerous precedent. She would think she could do whatever she wanted without consequences, and I wasn't about to let that happen. So, I made the decision to fight back, fully committed to clearing my name and showing Karen that her actions had consequences. If she wanted to make this into a legal battle, then I'd make sure she lost. It wasn't just about protecting my pond anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could manipulate the system to get away with their own foolishness. I had no idea how long this would drag out, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her bully me into submission. As the days dragged on, the pressure from Karen's legal threats mounted. I spent more time gathering evidence, gathering witness statements, and consulting with Maxine to build the best defense I could. I knew that Karen's case was flimsy at best, but she was determined to drag me into a prolonged legal battle that would cost me time, money, and peace of mind. The first step in preparing for court was meeting with Maxine to go over the facts of the case. I gathered photos of the pond, showing how clear it was that the edge had been visible and not a hidden hazard. I also brought in a few of my neighbors who had seen Karen racing her ATV across the property in the past. They could testify that Karen had always driven recklessly and that I had frequently warned her about the dangerous edges near the pond. Maxine reviewed all of it with careful attention. "The law is on your side, no doubt about it. Karen is responsible for her own reckless actions. She was warned, and this is an attempt to shift the blame onto you. But we need to make sure we're prepared for every angle." As we sat there, I could feel the anxiety beginning to lift. Maxine was confident. She had a track record of winning ridiculous cases just like this, where someone tried to manipulate the system for their own gain. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Karen was trying to make me out as a villain because of her own carelessness. I couldn't let her get away with it. A week later, I got a call from Karen's lawyer. He was short and to the point. "We've reviewed your defense, and we're not interested in continuing this case. We're open to a settlement. My client is willing to drop the lawsuit in exchange for you covering her medical expenses and the cost of her ATV repair." I was taken aback. A settlement? After all of this? Karen wanted me to pay for her mistakes because she had been reckless? I wasn't about to let that happen. "No, we're not settling," I said firmly. "You know as well as I do that this is a baseless claim. Karen's actions are her responsibility, and I will not pay for her carelessness. If she wants to proceed with this lawsuit, let her. We'll see what the court has to say." There was silence on the other end of the line before the lawyer spoke again, sounding almost surprised at my refusal. "All right then, we'll be in touch with court dates." I hung up the phone feeling more determined than ever. Karen's lawyer clearly thought I would back down, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. This was about principle, not money. I wasn't going to let her manipulate the system or use me as a scapegoat. The weeks leading up to the trial were tense. I was doing everything I could to prepare, organizing my documents, reviewing my statements, and continuing to work with Maxine on refining our case. I also made sure to stay calm. I couldn't let Karen or her lawyer get under my skin. As the day of the trial approached, I felt a surge of confidence. Maxine had reassured me again and again that Karen's case was weak, and everything pointed to the fact that I wasn't responsible for her poor decisions. The court would see through her attempt to shift blame, and I would be vindicated. When the day of the trial finally came, I walked into the courtroom, ready to fight for my rights and put an end to this absurd lawsuit once and for all. It wasn't just about defending my property. It was about standing up to injustice and refusing to let someone bully me into accepting false responsibility. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for anyone who had ever been wrongfully accused or manipulated by someone trying to take advantage of the system. This was the moment that would define how Karen's actions would be seen, and I was ready to make sure the truth came out. As the trial date loomed closer, something unexpected began to happen. Word of Karen's lawsuit had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Karen's reputation, already a bit tarnished by her history of being difficult and overbearing, started to deteriorate even more. People who had once been silent bystanders were now stepping up, offering support for me in ways I hadn't imagined. It started with small gestures, neighbors stopping by to check in, offering their moral support, and reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. But it didn't stop there. A few of the more outspoken neighbors began sharing their experiences with Karen, stories about how she had tried to dictate rules on their properties, demanded things that were unreasonable, and generally made life harder for everyone around her. One evening, I received a knock on my door. It was Tina, a neighbor I didn't know very well but who had always been friendly. She came over with a stack of signed letters, including testimonies from several neighbors who were willing to speak up in my defense. They were all willing to attest to Karen's reckless behavior in the past and her habit of ignoring warnings. It was clear that Karen's actions weren't a one-time mistake. They were part of a pattern of disregard for other people's rights. "This is going to help a lot," Tina said, handing me the letters. "We know what she did to you isn't right, and we want to make sure you have all the support you need." Her words meant more to me than she realized. The support wasn't just about winning the case. It was about people standing up together and refusing to let someone like Karen push us around anymore. A few days before the trial, the community held an impromptu rally in my honor. It was small but powerful. A group of neighbors and friends gathered outside my house with signs that read things like, "We stand with your name," and "Karen's reckless driving equals Karen's responsibility." The message was clear. This was about justice, not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. It was a show of solidarity. Some of the neighbors, including Bob, who had been one of the first to speak up at the HOA meeting, even spoke at the rally. "We can't let one person abuse the system just because they think they can get away with it," Bob said, his voice strong. "We're here because we believe in fairness and accountability, and we know that your name doesn't deserve to be treated this way." The rally made the local news, and suddenly, Karen's lawsuit wasn't just a private legal issue, it was a public cause. The local reporters, many of whom had covered Karen's HOA antics in the past, began digging deeper into her history. It didn't take long for people to realize that Karen wasn't the victim. She was the perpetrator in a long line of incidents where she had tried to manipulate others to get what she wanted. The day of the trial arrived, and as I walked into the courthouse, I was no longer just a person defending their property. I was the voice of everyone who had ever been taken advantage of by someone like Karen. As I entered the courtroom, I was greeted by the familiar faces of my neighbors, some of whom had come to support me in person. They were here because they believed in what was right, and their presence gave me strength. Karen, of course, was seated with her lawyer, and she looked angry. She was trying to play the role of the victim once again, but the evidence was stacked against her. It didn't take long for the judge to start reviewing the facts, and as we went through the testimonies, it became clear Karen was the one who had been reckless, and the blame couldn't be shifted onto me. The community's support played a huge role in the case. The judge considered the testimonies from my neighbors, and Karen's lawyer didn't have much to stand on. Karen's argument that I was responsible for her driving into the pond fell apart under scrutiny. We also had witnesses who had seen Karen driving carelessly before, and the judge could see that this wasn't an isolated incident. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor, dismissing Karen's case. Karen lost, and not only did she have to pay for her own legal fees, but the court also recommended she undergo driving safety courses as a consequence of her reckless behavior. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red as the verdict was read. I could hear her grumble under her breath, but the judge wasn't done. "And I would like to remind you, Ms. Karen, that reckless driving and shifting the blame for your own actions will not be tolerated," the judge added firmly. It was over. Karen had lost, and I was vindicated. When I left the courthouse, the community's support was overwhelming. I hadn't just won the case, I had won back my sense of peace and my right to defend my property. The neighbors who had supported me celebrated alongside me, and the victory felt even sweeter knowing we had all come together as one to face down the injustice Karen had tried to impose. Karen's reputation in the neighborhood was irreparably damaged. She had come to the court with nothing but lies and manipulation, and now she had to face the consequences. But the real victory wasn't in the court ruling. It was in the sense of unity we had found as a community. No longer would we stand by silently when someone tried to impose their will on us. We had shown that when we stick together, we are stronger than any one person, no matter how loud they scream or how many times they threaten to take us down. Karen had learned a valuable lesson. You can't blame others for your mistakes, and you certainly can't manipulate the system to get away with them. And for me, the victory wasn't just about defending my pond, it was about standing up for what was right and ensuring that I would never back down again. The days following the trial were a strange mix of relief and celebration. The courtroom victory felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For weeks, I had been consumed by Karen's lawsuit, but now, with the judge's ruling, I could finally move forward. But the victory was not just personal, it felt like a triumph for the entire community. My neighbors, who had supported me from the very beginning, celebrated alongside me, proud of how we'd all stood together against Karen's manipulation. I had learned that the strength of community was something far more powerful than any individual, even one as persistent and controlling as Karen. As the weeks passed, Karen's attempt to sue me began to fade into the background of neighborhood life. She tried to maintain her usual front of authority, but it was clear that the once strong grip she had on the neighborhood was slipping. People had seen her for what she truly was, a person who would stop at nothing to try to get her way, even at the expense of others. Her reputation was in tatters, and word had spread fast. Neighbors who once tiptoed around her now spoke out against her. I noticed more gatherings at my place, from weekend barbecues to more formal neighborhood meetings, where we'd discuss everything from property maintenance to community events. The rallying together, the support I received, had changed how we all interacted. No longer were we just neighbors living in the same area. We were now a community of people who had proven that standing together could change the course of things for the better. It wasn't just a legal win that felt so satisfying. It was how we had all taken control of our neighborhood and taken a stand for what was right. Karen may have tried to manipulate the system, but she had lost because we didn't let her. It felt like we had all won together, even if only a few of us had been directly involved in the case. Karen eventually moved on from her legal fight, but she never quite regained the same level of influence she once had. The neighborhood began to feel a lot more comfortable and welcoming without her constant complaints and demands. People were no longer afraid to speak up or enjoy their property without fear of her judgment. As for me, I couldn't help but smile as I looked out over my pond on the weekends. The sun would shimmer across the water, and I'd hear the soft laughter of my neighbors and friends enjoying another cookout or gathering by the water. My property, which had once been a source of tension, had transformed into a place where everyone felt welcome. The cook-offs and gatherings we'd started became a yearly tradition, a reminder of the victory not just in court but in the way we'd taken back control of our own lives. And for once, I could truly say that justice had been served, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of everyone who had come together to fight back against Karen's unreasonable demands. As I sat down on the porch, watching the ripples across the pond, I knew this victory was bigger than a single case. It was about community, standing up for each other, and realizing that together, we could withstand anything. Karen's loss had become the neighborhood's gain. And it had shown us all that when we stand united, nothing, not even a lawsuit or an ATV accident, could ever break us apart. Just when I thought things had finally calmed down, life threw me a curveball. A few weeks after the trial, I received an unexpected letter, But this one wasn't from Karen's lawyer. Instead, it was from the local news station, the one that had covered the rally and the court proceedings. The letter was an invitation to appear on a local talk show to discuss the case, and the broader implications it had for communities dealing with overbearing neighbors and unreasonable HOA demands. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to revisit the whole ordeal. But as I thought about it, I realized that this might be an opportunity to set the record straight once and for all. Karen had tried to paint me as the villain, and now I had a chance to tell my side of the story, to highlight the importance of community, and how standing together can make a real difference. I agreed to the interview, and the day of the shoot, I felt a bit of nervous excitement. The studio was filled with bright lights and cameras, and the host was a friendly woman named Lena, who had followed the story from the beginning. She was keen to hear my perspective, not just on the lawsuit, but on how it had sparked a shift in the neighborhood. "So you took on Karen, and you won, but it was more than just a legal victory, wasn't it?" Lena asked, looking directly at me. I nodded, feeling the weight of it all as I reflected on how this had been more than just about an accident. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could get away with taking advantage of the system. But it was also about the community coming together. This case brought out something in all of us, the realization that we could fight back when we needed to, but we could also support each other when we wanted to make a change. The interview was a success. The community's story was now getting out to a wider audience, and I was humbled by the support from everyone who had rallied behind me. The story was not just about the lawsuit, it was about resilience and the power of standing up for what's right, even when faced with absurd challenges. As the interview aired, something surprising happened. The neighborhood's newfound unity began to spread. Other communities in the area reached out to me, telling me how they had dealt with similar issues with neighbors, HOA conflicts, and how they had seen what had happened in my community as inspiring. It became clear that the impact of our small victory had spread beyond my property. People were beginning to rethink their relationships with their neighbors, their rights, and how they could defend their space without feeling like they were constantly walking on eggshells. Karen, of course, wasn't happy about the extra attention. In the weeks following the interview, she tried to make a scene at a few more neighborhood events. But now, when she tried to pull the same control tactics, she found herself faced with a community that had changed. People who had once feared her now stood firm, and Karen found herself increasingly isolated. Months later, things had returned to a new normal. My property was peaceful once again, but this time, it wasn't just a place to hide away from the world. It was a symbol of what could happen when a community stood together against unjust actions. The pond, which had once been the site of so much conflict, had now become the backdrop for neighborhood gatherings that celebrated unity and growth. And then, in an unexpected twist, I received another visit from Karen. She didn't come to complain or cause trouble. Instead, she came to apologize. "I was wrong," she admitted, standing at my doorstep, her posture deflated and vulnerable. "I let my pride get in the way. I made a huge mistake, and I'm sorry for dragging you through all of that." I was taken aback. I had never expected her to admit fault, let alone apologize. She seemed genuinely remorseful, but I couldn't help but feel a little hesitant. "I don't know if an apology fixes everything," I said carefully. "But I appreciate you acknowledging what happened." Karen nodded, looking down at her feet. "I've learned a lot from this," she said softly. "I'll do better. I hope we can at least put this behind us." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing on my porch, a little stunned. The final resolution was bittersweet, but it felt like the right end to the chapter. Karen had learned a hard lesson, and so had I. Justice had been served, not just in the courtroom, but in the community's collective spirit. We had all become stronger, and while Karen's actions had caused a lot of trouble, they had ultimately led to growth for everyone involved. As I looked out at the calm pond, now the backdrop of so many happy memories, I realized that this had been more than just a fight over a legal case. It had been a journey of growth, and it had reminded us all that standing up for what is right is always worth the struggle. Karen's ATV accident might have started the conflict, but the community and the victory were the lasting results. And that was a win that would last far beyond any courtroom.